So let me actually use that time to introduce the moderator for our next panel, which is going to be on industrial capacity. How can we build the capacity to build more in America? And that is Josh Zoffer. Josh is a principal at Clock Tower Ventures, which invests in climate tech and fintech companies. He served as a special assistant to the president in the National Economic Council. One of my regrets from my time in DC was that I left just before Josh joined the White House, so we didn't get a chance to work together. So I convinced him to spend time with us as a CEPR Policy Fellow. And so I've enjoyed our conversations when he commutes up from LA to the Bay Area. So I think now that we're set up, I'll introduce Josh and the rest of the panel to the stage. Thank you.
So let me start by, first of all, thank you, Neil, for organizing this and helping to bring this great panel together. Let me start by introducing the panelists. To my left, or your right, is Mike Schmidt. Mike served as the head of the CHIPS office at the Department of Commerce, implementing the more than $50 billion that was allocated to build out the US semiconductor industry. Before that, he served as the New York State's tax commissioner, and in between those two things, I had the privilege of working with Mike at the Treasury Department. Next, we have Arnab Datta. Arnab is a managing director at Employ America and director of infrastructure policy at the Institute for Progress. I had the privilege of getting to get ideas from Arnab when I worked in the White House. He was one of the most creative people who kind of helped push the White House forward, even at times when we didn't want to be pushed. And then lastly, Ted Nordhaus is the co-founder and director of research at the Breakthrough Institute and has been a leading voice on energy policy, particularly advocating for the build-out of nuclear, which was not always a popular policy and is now very much a popular policy. So before I start the panel, let me answer the burning question that I think you all are, I'm sure, are thinking about, which is, what is industrial capacity? And there is like a technical answer to this question. If you Google industrial capacity, you can go on the Federal Reserve's website, and there's a metric that basically says, like, if you add it up, for every car factory, how many cars could it make per year working at max capacity? You did that for every factory, for every good, and then said, like, what's the total? That's the sort of technical economic answer to what is industrial capacity. I think in reality, one of the things we've learned over the past few years as the US has tried to build more is that there's actually more that goes into building things than just having factories, right? You need the right expertise in how to run and build those factories. You need the right equipment inside those factories, the right process innovations and techniques. You need people who know how to build those things, right, who have been educated in cutting edge engineering techniques. And so all of that, I think, is going to be part of the conversation that we have today. So let me start by turning to each of you and asking, when you think about the industrial capacity we need as a country, what is it and what is holding us back from acquiring and building it? We'll start with Mike.
So I think we need to articulate goals around industrial capacity in a way that is beyond kind of jobs and general economic prosperity. In the case of CHIPS, it's about national security. And CHIPS was a bipartisan piece of legislation where members of Congress and the administration came together and they said it is not okay that we are relying on Taiwan for nearly 100% of our leading edge logic semiconductors in a world in which, on Taiwan for that, in a world where AI is right around the corner. And so I think you got to, and I don't think CHIPS is the only one. I think there are other industries, but I think you have to start from a really strong premise. And then what is the thing holding us back? I think I start with, we have a lot of strengths. I think I say one thing that the abundance conversation sometimes loses is that we have tremendous human capital. We have, relatively speaking, although this is obviously being tested, remarkable macroeconomic strength, political stability, rule of law. When you look around the world and you're trying to decide where to build a $20 billion factory, these things matter a lot. And I think in the case of CHIPS, we have shown that our society does have the ability to mobilize around the development of industrial capacity in strategic sectors. So we have seen more investment in electronics manufacturing since CHIPS was authorized than the previous 30 years combined. I mean, true, and that's not like announcements, those aren't press releases, that's dollars in the ground, true hockey stick effect. The total announcements of planned investment is around $500 billion now. There are 5 companies in the world that can produce leading edge semiconductors along logic and memory. All 5 of them have major projects in the United States of America. There's no other economy in the world that has more than 2. So in that sense, CHIPS, it's a very optimistic story, right? Like we can create a bipartisan consensus, set a national goal, and produce real outcomes. And the experience of managing the CHIPS program is this sense that we have a lot of work to do as a country to be able to do this in a sustainable way. I kind of sometimes felt like you're on a football team that's maybe you win a few games early in the season, you're really excited about it, but in the pit of your stomach you say, man, I don't think we have what it takes to win the championship. That's kind of how I feel right now. I remember I was in Taiwan, and the major dominant semiconductor manufacturer in the world is a company called TSMC. They basically produce all those leading edge logic chips. Incredible company. And I was touring the facility where they're going to build their 2 nanometer chips, and these things are massive scale. It's like a single fab is 11 football fields large and uses twice as much steel as the Empire State Building. They're, in Arizona, they're now building 6 of those here. But he was talking me through the process in Taiwan to build a fab, and a single fab in Taiwan takes 60 permits, which actually was more than I would have thought. That's a lot of permits. In Japan, they need 300 permits to build a fab. In Arizona, they need 600. And they're kind of working through that. But I think that's the state and local level. At the federal level, there are fewer permits, but they can be quite rigid and difficult to work with. Actually don't create a lot of mechanisms for the types of trade-offs that Bharat was talking about, particularly when it comes to national security. I think the state capacity, to manage in government and to have to hire and contracting and the NEPA and the Environmental Review and the Paperwork Reduction Act and the Fly America Act and the Buy America. And I think the accumulation of kind of rules that this is the kind of Jen Pahlka thesis, I think is hugely important. So, we are doing a lot to make it harder on ourselves. And so I think that, but I don't think it's rocket science to figure it out. I think that's the optimistic thing. And I think with, in CHIPS, for example, sustained bipartisan consensus, we ended up with legislation to give us some relief on environmental review. It didn't give us everything we needed, but, and that type of sustained commitment over time is, I think, actually what it's going to take.
Before we go to Arnab, there's some misinformation out there. I just want to get, for the record, did we build a fab?
Yes.
Important to get that out there on the record.
We are now producing leading edge chips in the United States for the first time in, over a decade. So that's a pretty good thing.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. So I think when I think about industrial capacity, I think about, so one of the shops I work at, Employ America, we really care about full employment and macroeconomic stability. And I really think about how can we build more capacity, resilience in the economy. I think there's just a sense that over the last couple of decades, there's just been a lot of shocks, and they've had really harmful macroeconomic effects, harmful effects on workers. And so I really come at it from that perspective. How can we build more resilience in the key sectors we need to have less inflation and a full employment economy? When I think about the barriers, I think I would highlight 2 things specifically. So we don't have enough private sector investment in industrial sectors, in strategic industrial sectors in the U.S. The reasons for that, we could have a whole panel on that, but it's just really not the best economic investment decision for the private sector right now. And so I come at it from, that's a public policy problem. And so how can we use public policy, particularly at the federal government level, to catalyze more private investment and also have more public investment. And I think it needs to start from a public investment standpoint because we're trying to fulfill public policy goals. And so I see two real big barriers to that. One is on the state's capacity to execute the kind of agreements, the kind of lending, the kind of contracting you need to catalyze the private investment that you seek. And so, everything from how we contract at federal agencies, the rules around lending and what types of entities we can lend to and can't lend to, these are all really important barriers, and to a large extent, they tie the federal government's hands at pursuing like the best policy. One place that this isn't true actually is the CHIPS office, which used something called Other Transactions Authority pretty robustly, and I think it's very good that Congress legislated that, and it was something that made them able to tailor these contracts to what the private sector need was, and also still contract for important public goals. So that's really, I think, one major challenge. And then related to the state capacity piece, we heard Bharat talk about the Administrative Procedures Act. I'd really emphasize that, and particularly one law called NEPA, which is not the be-all, end-all. It's not the only permitting fix we need to make, but it serves a unique purpose as a litigation magnet for federal investment and federal action. And I think the impact that has both on the public sector, so the impact it has on agencies and the fact that they have to create litigation-proof documents, and just how time-consuming that process is and how wasteful it is, frankly, at like actual good policy and recognizing trade-offs is really, really harmful. And then also on the private sector, because the private sector ends up paying in delays for what are ostensibly public sector mistakes. So I'd just like to talk through one example. There's a huge transmission line called Cardinal Hickory Creek that was planned, and they started the public process in 2014. 2019, this is a huge transmission line going through the Midwest to connect over 150 clean energy projects to the grid. So really important. Every year it was delayed. It added, I think, 100,000 tons of carbon to the atmosphere, basically. But in 2014, that public process began. In 2019, it got approval from the local commission in Iowa. In 2019, sorry. In 2020, it got approval from the, I think it was Wisconsin Public Utility Sector. In 2020, near the end of the year, it also got approvals from the Fish and Wildlife Service and the Army Corps of Engineers. And then in 2021, it got its NEPA record of decision at the U.S. Department of Agriculture, the Rural Utilities Service. And so it was approved under NEPA. It was immediately sued for not correctly, looking at one of the reasonable alternatives, a land swap agreement. And so the project was enjoined. Now, if that were it and they went back to the drawing board, that would be one thing. When that case was in court, so when they were litigating the process, the agencies and the developers went back to the drawing board and they said, look, we might lose this lawsuit. Let's start to think about an alternative. And over 9 months, they hammered out a land swap agreement to basically inoculate themselves that if we get enjoined, we can offer this as our alternative, and it should, rectify what the court has identified. So they did that. The injunction was issued. They came back. They issued a supplemental NEPA, EIS that included that land swap decision, and then that was enjoined. And the judge said in that injunction, characterized it as like, you guys went back and you negotiated this deal in your back room, basically, and like now you're coming with no public input and you want us to accept it? Like, that's unacceptable. And I just think about the incentives here. Like, we're trying to develop. These companies and these agencies went back, saying like we should hedge our risk, and they got penalized for it. Now, ultimately, luckily, that injunction was thrown out, and we've finally connected Cardinal Hickory, in 2024, 10 years after that public process began. But that type of uncertainty, I mean, for the economists in the room, I'm not an economist to be clear, but that's like Knightian uncertainty, Frank Knight. It's like there's no way to quantify it. And this is the risk that developers need to take. And it's not just in the energy context, it's chips manufacturers too. Like they have to go through, they had to go through NEPA, they don't anymore. They got an exemption, which is
Not all of them.
good, yeah. But that was I think a real concern. And so these are, I think, the types of uncertainty we really need to think about when we think about barriers to industrial capacity.
Thanks. Try to make some remarks and not cover too much ground that's already been covered here. But I think it's useful to go back to the question of why do we want industrial capacity? What is it for? And I think there's really kind of three reasons, if you kind of look at it historically. So, the first reason, if you're, a developing country, you're in something, is you want industrial capacity to industrialize. You have a large agrarian, very poor agrarian population. And you really can't actually be a not poor country if most of your population is doing very low productivity work in kind of basically subsistence agriculture. And so literally every country that has had any success development, not being poor anymore, moving most of its population out of poverty, basically does the same thing, which is you take a whole lot of your population and you entice, force, coerce, whatever set of adjectives you want to put around it, and you move them from rural agrarian sort of economic contexts into sort of urban, industrialized, higher productivity sectors of the economy. And historically, kind of the best way to do that was manufacturing, because at least historically, that's where you could take a large, low-skilled, poorly educated population, stick it in a factory, kind of making widgets, and quite substantially increase labor productivity, which is how you create economic surplus, which is how you then kind of go build a modern society in a variety of ways. So that's the first reason that you want it. If you live in an advanced, developed economy like the United States that industrialized, 100 plus years ago, that's not a very kind of compelling reason. That's why China and other developing countries are still very focused on these sectors and industrial capacity, not why we are. Then the second reason that you care about industrial capacity is because, you want all the outputs. You want, modern housing and energy and heating and cooling and, just all the physical stuff that we're literally surrounded by just sitting here. And then all the digital stuff, all the other things. That's interesting because, I think once you're into a kind of fairly globalized economy, you don't necessarily need to make that stuff domestically. And so, over the last generation particularly, you had a lot of folks who are now kind of labeled sometimes derisively as neoliberals who said, well, why do we care if we make all this stuff here? It's fine for it to get made in China or various other places. And if they want to subsidize it, just subsidizing it to be cheaper for us. Great, better for us. That is an argument that kind of makes sense if you actually live in a frictionless, very integrated, globalized market economy. To varying degrees, particularly after the Cold War, that's where a lot of people thought the world was heading. But that's not actually the world we live in. And so that gets to kind of the third reason. And I think the thing that really does drive a lot of the conversation and should drive most of the conversation about why we care about industrial capacity. And that is basically purely for geopolitical reasons. If your economy depends on oil or batteries or chips or whatever, and you are buying all of your chips and batteries, whatever, from sort of geopolitical rivals who to varying degrees are not, you have concerns that if sort of there were various sorts of conflicts with those rivals, they might stop giving you all this good stuff that they're making cheaper than you, or maybe even subsidizing so they're cheaper for you. Then you kind of go, well, okay, we don't want that. That's a bad idea. We need to either make more of that stuff ourselves, or we need to source it from places. And that's really, I think, the reason that we're particularly having this conversation right now is sort of after, like 3 decades of globalization and sort of normalizing trade and sort of Chinese mercantilism, particularly kind of America wakes up, particularly during the pandemic, and it's like, holy crap, we can't even make the masks, and we need the masks. I think the question around industrial capacity is not as a generalized thing, but it's what industrial capacity do we need? In what sectors of our economy, for what reasons? And that becomes, I think, a much more interesting conversation, both around sort of where do you really need it? If you're not going to have it, where do you want to get it from? In other words, like, who are the allies that you'd be like, it's okay, for you to make the widgets that our economy depends on, so that we're not dependent on other people making these widgets. And then I think the other interesting question is of course, then how do you get the capacity that you need, and how do you, in this sort of kind of political, that's where all the state capacity conversations come in. I think that's where a lot of the industrial policy conversation comes in. And I think, there's kind of a healthy, debate that I kind of witnessed most kind of directly. And, it's sort of like the stuff that you know best, and the stuff that I know best is the energy side of those debates. And, I think there are a bunch of ways that those conversations kind of went off the rails, or at least were less disciplined. And this is, my sense is mostly a kind of left of center audience here. So we're having an abundance conversation in that context. But I think in the last administration, where, sort of a Democratic administration and Congress get very focused on this, I think there were some ways in which that conversation became not as disciplined as it needed to be. We sort of started thinking that there were times where it felt like we were doing industrial policy for its own sake. There were times where we confused sort of various things that we were doing to sell the policy, like all the great jobs we were going to create, with like the purpose of the policies, which really, particularly in the energy sector, energy is the master resource. The thing that matters with energy is that it's cheap and abundant, and then it's cheap and abundant energy ramifies through your entire economy. It's not about jobs making solar panels or batteries or even electric vehicles. It's actually about having cheap energy across the entire economy. That's where you get actually employing, that's where you get, as Arnab has worked on, so I think done such important work on, that's where you get economic benefits and employment and growth. And then I think the other, the other thing that we did, because, I think on the left particularly, everyone got so, frankly crazy and catastrophic about climate change, is we tried to sort of tie a bunch of this industrial capacity stuff also to like very ambitious and short-term emissions goals. And I think that had, which we can talk about as we go on, I'll kind of wrap up my opening remarks, but I think that also had a bunch of, let's say, negative or unintended consequences in terms of both how we approached a set of those policy questions, the ways that we sort of tied them to various sorts of mandates and other objectives, and the ways in which we sort of tried to kind of push parts of the system a lot harder and faster than it really could go. So I'll stop there.
Well, we will definitely have to come back to the left getting too crazy about climate change. But let me pick up on one thing that you said about what capacity you want and you don't, because I think this in some ways gets to one of the hardest questions about industrial capacity. You know, I think it was 2023, Jake Sullivan, who was President Biden's national security advisor, gave this speech where he described what we were trying to do when it came to what capacity we wanted to build and what we didn't, as building a small yard with a high fence. And the speech was about semiconductors, and chips, but that was sort of the governing philosophy at a theoretical level. And I think it's fair to say that's not really what ended up happening, or at least it was hard to draw the line of where that fence was. So just to give a few framing examples, right? When we did our tariff policies against China in the summer of 2024, we added tariffs in strategic areas where sort of, there's a clear-cut case in areas like, semiconductors and EVs, but also on areas like solar panels and steel and aluminum. And of course, we kept all of Trump's tariffs that were already there on things like food and baby clothes, which I don't think most people would put in the industrial capacity we really need column. Similarly, this got hard in the case of the Nippon Steel deal, right? Where you said, what can we rely on our allies to make? Well, the question was, is it okay for the only remaining steel capacity in the United States to be owned by Japan? Is that inside or outside of the fence that we're trying to draw? And then now you have the Trump administration that sort of seems to think everything is inside the fence, right? The Office of the Trade Representative tweeted maybe a week ago that they're going to bring back American apparel manufacturing, which again, I'm not sure is in the super high value industrial capacity.
And they're using IEEPA.
Yeah, that's right. There's an international economic emergency in t-shirts. So let me put it to you guys, how would you draw what's inside and outside of that fence?
I'll just start. I'll be totally honest. I think it is under-theorized. I think it is hugely important, and not fully theorizing this thing puts us in a position where we're having this loose conversation with IEEPA being used for t-shirts, right? And so I'm in this fortunate position because everyone always says well, chips is obviously, and so obviously chips is national security. That's great, But even though with chips we say it's economic and national security, right? Well, what economic security? What is that? You know what I mean? So I do think that these are loose concepts, and I think it is really important over the next couple of years to put some guardrails around it. Now, that should not be taken to mean that we need to be too careful about painting inside those lines, right? We can make errors of commission in addition to omission in the goal of saying, hey, we got a real problem in terms of too much reliance on the PRC, on critical strategic sectors, reliance on Taiwan, and so we need to do a little more rather than a little less. That would be good for a change. But that doesn't, I think, let us off the hook for doing the work to really clearly articulate what those are. Intuitively, I do think there is a fair amount of early bipartisan consensus. You actually push a lot of the advocates of the tariff regime around strategic sectors. What do we really care about? You talk about electronics and the kind of AI supply chain. You usually talk about pharma and kind of medical supply chains. You usually talk about energy, right? And so it's actually a set of things that feel pretty similar to various under-read reports that the Biden administration put out. So I actually think there's a lot of opportunity here for bipartisan consensus, but I think the work needs to be done to truly draw those lines and those boundaries.
Yeah, so we actually worked on this in the context of a bill we worked with Senator Coons' office on called the Industrial Finance Corporation Act, and we had a series of.
Can you tell everyone what was it?
Yeah, so the Industrial Finance Corporation Act it's a bill to establish a industrial finance corporation. So this was a government corporation with a pretty wide toolkit of authorities: lending, acquisition, a lot of different tools that would invest in strategic sectors in the U.S. And part of the, so we had worked to get a bipartisan introduction. We held a number of roundtables on exactly this question. We ended up getting a Republican co-sponsor, but he happened to then be announced as the vice presidential pick, and so we didn't release that bill. But it was where we kind of landed was, and you know, at Employ America, we spent a lot of time thinking about the Federal Reserve. I see this as like, we don't want to dictate these ahead of time, right? Like, the world just moves too fast. We don't know what the strategic sector is going to be in 2 years or 5 years necessarily. Like, we had a chips shortage in 2020, and we passed the CHIPS Act in 2022, right? Like, Congress can just kind of move too slowly on this stuff. And so I think like a good model as an institution is the Federal Reserve, which has, you know, some semblance of independence. Hopefully that sticks around, you know, knock on wood. And, you know, it's certainly got political accountability. It's accountable to Congress. And if you had an institution like that had a, you know, technocratic, very highly skilled staff with capacity to like do what they do best and identify these sectors and then potentially even deploy capital to build resilience in those sectors, I think that's something that could probably pass a democratic legitimacy test, still be congressionally accountable, but also, you know, deploy fast enough when we have a crisis, you know, that we need to. And so I think kind of more like the institutional design to figuring that out. There's another version of this that, you know, now Secretary Rubio introduced with, I guess, local Representative Ro Khanna, to establish this within the kind of executive branch directly. And so you know, they created kind of a council that would develop a national investment strategy that would then be responsible for coordinating with different agencies to make sure that it was like holistic and that we weren't kind of being duplicative in different areas. But part of that was designating these sectors. So I think that's also a model, but I like the independent one.
I'll just say, chips are in and T-shirts are out.
Bold take.
Yeah. I know it when I see it.
So right now, we're watching a very aggressive approach that is ostensibly geared toward building industrial capacity playing out at the federal level, right? We are all living in like the post-Liberation Day era, for better or worse. And you know, there is a lot that is happening in the Trump administration, but in some ways at the very highest level, I think they share the objective that many of us share vis-a-vis wanting more industrial capacity and thinking that, you know, there is some amount that is more than we have today that would be good. And you know, I think question for everyone, but particularly, you know, Arnab and Ted, who both I think have been instrumental in kind of, you know, pushing the boundaries of kind of what's inside the box of acceptable, you know, left-leaning policy positions and where the Democratic Party is willing to go. Anything that this administration is doing that you see as, you know, defensible or a place where there's a potential consensus to build around and take forward?
You want to take that first?
Sure. I mean, it's funny, you know, I spoke on a panel in Italy last month, and it was like a big finance and economics conference, and you know, they asked me before the election to come, and I was going to be like kind of the guy who could talk about like climate change, because you had to check, back then you had to check that box, and by the time I got there, you didn't really need to check the box anymore. No one in this kind of audience seemed to care anymore. I very much felt like I was an afterthought, but I was able to listen in to, you know, very serious people, like, you know, like chief economist type people talk, and this was literally happening during Liberation, you know, like on Liberation Day, you know, like literally the entire, like the national Italian television news was like in the lobby to kind of try to do like, you know, interviews with, you know, famous economists about what was going on and what was going to happen. But the thing that I was just struck by, I mean, I was surprised at what felt like kind of post hoc explanations of the sort of rationale behind all of this, and it involved de-dollarization of this, and you know, there were, you know, that there was a kind of grand strategic plan here, and I think that is not the case. So, you know, it's kind of like, well, what are they doing that's good and bad? Well, you mean today? Because like whatever I could talk about right now might get reversed tomorrow. You know, I think that there's kind of, it's kind of more performance art than like sort of a grand strategic plan here. So you do some stuff that you said you were going to do or you think might be a good idea and sort of see how everybody reacts and then take a bunch of it back and then do some more of it. So, I mean, in theory, there probably are some sensible things here. Obviously I'm in the, I do a lot of work on like nuclear, and this is an administration that sort of on its sort of self-description of itself would tell you it is very committed to nuclear, and they're going to go get, new reactors built literally during this term. Which is also, I think, very unlikely to happen. And I can look at what they're going to kind of do at the NRC and with a bunch of other stuff, and there's sort of some things that, like, on paper look like they could be really good, and the devil's going to be kind of in the details. At the end of the day, we're going to get a year and a half into this thing, and we're going to find out if, like, literally there's anyone who's still like, yep, I want to go build a nuclear reactor in this country. And right now, I'm not clear to me that, whether it may be that there's lots of people, and it may be that there's like no one, because I just think we don't know what they're going to do, and I'm not sure that in a lot of cases they know what they're going to do at this point. So it's a hard. I appreciate the question. It's a hard one to answer. I think that the one thing I will say is that I think we're well served to not get sort of too far down the ladders of, like this Ways and Means bill came out and like it would just basically repeal the entire IRA. And there's a huge conversation going on about what would happen to the US energy and clean energy sectors if that is like the reconciliation package. And I think if we know only one thing, that is not going to be the reconciliation package. I don't know what it's going to be, but that's an opening gambit from like the budget hawks in Congress, in the Republican coalition. And, it's the beginning of a negotiation, not the end of it. So, I think it's important also not to get kind of too far down the line of like, they're going to actually do X, which they haven't actually done yet, and X is going to have Y consequences, which in a lot of cases we don't really understand either. So it's not a very satisfying answer, but I would just say like, I think the four of us could sit on this panel and agree on a lot of things that if you kind of squinted could be good from what this administration is trying to do. And I'm not sure that, like a week from now, we would say the same things because it will all have changed.
Yeah, I started hopeful in some areas. Like we've done a lot of work on energy policy. I was lucky enough to work with Josh and a lot of awesome friendly faces in this audience on some strategic petroleum reserve policy at when they were in the administration. I was hopeful that Chris Wright is like someone who's smart and understands the economics of the domestic shale industry and would be a champion for smart policies, including, you may not have heard, some that were passed in the last administration. But he's going out and saying things like, we're just going to drill, baby, drill at $50 a barrel. And that's just like, incoherent and just not accurate. So like I lost my hope pretty quickly. I thought that like the smart people were gonna act as a control, and it just doesn't seem that that's so. I think someone at CERAWeek, which is this big energy conference, an oil executive, summed it up pretty nicely when he said to a reporter, we thought Chris Wright was gonna be our guy, but it turns out he's Trump's guy. And I mean, maybe you should have known that because he's working in a Trump administration. There are, I think, like within any administration, like they're huge. There's a lot of people and a lot of diversity, and so we do have people who are close to the vice president's office who believe in the bill that I worked on, the industrial finance bill. Like I think figuring out how to create the space for those people to advocate for those ideas, and so that we can like get to some kind of bipartisan consensus. Like, I would hope that that's there, but I'm, not a lot of confidence being inspired at the moment. Yeah, just honestly.
Yeah, I mean, in many ways, I feel the same, right? At the very highest level, right? If you were to tick down like the 1 or 2 word summaries of things they care about, reindustrialization, critical minerals, you could sort of hope that there would have been more stuff in common that felt like actually not all is headed in the wrong direction. And I think, unfortunately, particularly given the IRA fight that is ongoing, it's hard to see that bearing out. Maybe to pick up on the comment you made earlier, Ted, about the role of climate change. I think industrial capacity is itself sort of like a pretty capacious term, right? Industrial capacity, as we've been talking about, like for what? And one of the things that the Biden administration certainly tried to do was to say there are other objectives and other political goals, climate change certainly among them, right, embodied in the IRA, that are pretty politically hard to do on their own, right? Just sort of saying like, we're gonna just do a climate change bill that is going to raise prices by, for example, taxing carbon is politically hard to get support behind. But attaching those ideas to, bills that are about, industrial capacity and job creation and domestic manufacturing makes it sort of, possible to kill 2 birds with 1 stone and get stuff done that is really important to many people, but might be hard otherwise. And I'm curious, how you think about, for everyone on the panel, whether it is a good idea to try to do that sort of like, let's, attach these different ideas that don't need to go together as a way of killing 2 birds with 1 stone, or whether, sort of with 2020 hindsight, you found that to be overdone or counterproductive.
Yeah, I mean, I would just, as sort of someone who kind of really invented the kind of a lot of the green jobs, clean economy rhetoric that Democrats have used over the last generation. I have some regrets. I think we were right about it in a, sort of basic political analysis, which was that you just needed to decenter climate change politically. That there are no climate voters. This is not a particularly politically salient issue. And if you're trying to kind of like center that in your political kind of sort of proposition to the electorate, you're going to run into problems. And so you go all the way back to even the Obama era, and it's like it's green jobs, it's kids here who sort of did a lot of that work, back then, in just sort of being like, no, we should see this as a sort of an investment, industrial policy, invest in these clean energy technologies of the future, and that's how we'll kind of modernize the American economy and create good jobs and deal with all sorts of other issues. So that was at least for a long time, it was a politically salient, very politically salient kind of way for Democrats to frame a lot of stuff that they were kind of really doing for climate reasons. But I think that the thing that happened is that, I think particularly after, post-Trump, I think the left got kind of crazy on a number of different ways. And one way they got crazy was around climate and got very apocalyptic about climate change. And we have to, we have 11 years and 1.5 degrees, this kind of basically made up threshold is this thing that we have to do, or it's like literally the world's going to end and nothing else matters. And so then you kind of get to, 2021 and you have a new administration. And we took all of that policy, which was really good. I think a lot of it was quite good investment, industrial policy, kind of focus on innovation and commercializing these new technologies. But then we started to try to tie it to like actually like emissions targets. And that's where I think both the politics and the policy really went off the rails. And we started trying to kind of substitute tax credits and subsidies and industrial policy for like, and use them as sort of like a reverse carbon price. Which was just it's a bad policy. It wouldn't work, and it was really, really bad politics. We basically kind of took all that IRA money that we kind of a huge amount of money, and then we like pumped it into a bunch of models and said, no, look, this is going, we had these like, you go look at the numbers that various credible modelers were putting out about like how with the IRA, the US was gonna like cut its emissions by 40+% in like 10 years. It was just, within a year, it was clear that all that modeling was just wrong, in part because it was so hard to build anything. But then like that all got put into like EPA tailpipe regulations and EPA power plant regulations, where EPA is literally like functionally phasing out gas and coal-fired power plants in less than 15 years, phasing out internal combustion engines. This was not going to work. It was the reason that everyone gave up on industrial policy a generation ago was because these were functionally output targets, industrial production targets, and we know that those don't work. And then the politics was terrible. I hosted a conference last year before the election where David Shor, who some people may know, pretty influential, like Democratic sort of pollster data guy, and David was like literally like if I was advising a candidate and they had to talk about one of two things, defund the police or their support for EVs, I would tell them to talk about defund the police. And he had data to back it up. So, and we took some things that, certainly 10 years ago were pretty popular broadly across the board, clean energy, electric vehicles, whatever, and we turned them into culture war objects. And obviously, there were plenty of folks on the other side of these debates who were doing that, but I think it's kind of like the left and environmental partisans and clean energy partisans kind of served a bunch of that up on a silver platter for opponents of a bunch of this stuff, and it became very, very politically problematic and sort of toxic, as well as being, I think in a lot of cases, not particularly good policy.
So why don't we go Arnab, Mike, and then we'll go to questions.
Yeah, I think, I think it's really important for policymakers in the Dem space to understand that the primary prism that everyone in this room, literally everyone on the planet, experiences energy is through energy prices as an economic issue. That's why we care about it in Employ America. It's because it's macroeconomically probably one of the most important sectors. And so, you need to, when you're thinking about energy policy, when you're advocating for energy policy, I think that's the most important thing to center. And, and green jobs is maybe the reason it wasn't as salient as as y'all had hoped is because that's still only a segment of jobs. But everyone pays a utility bill. Everyone puts gas in their car. And so, I guess if we're taking a very real life example right now, I mean, we're hoping that the IRA stays in place if you are, and we're in a world right now where natural gas prices have doubled over the past year, and that is going to pass through into electricity prices because our grid is heavily reliant on natural gas. And if you believe, for example, that, I mean, in addition to needing to power a lot of, AI data centers, if you believe that LNG exports are strategically important and useful for us because they create good paying jobs, but also because they help us displace natural gas from other producers who, like invading other countries. It's important for us to be adding a lot of very cheap capacity to the grid right now. And right now that's solar and wind. And so I think that we need to frame this really in those economic terms. If we pull this away and we keep a lot of LNG exports, prices are going to go up. This happened in Australia, and they had a very liberalized export regime for coal, for LNG as well, and their prices went up. And in the end, both the right and the left parties ended up supporting some version of price caps and export controls, which I think makes sense in that political environment, but I think we can generally agree are not ideal policies. So that's how I would kind of push folks on the left to frame things.
I won't comment on the climate piece, but I will say, just experience in the context of chips, is it was really important to keep the main thing the main thing. It's really important to have an overarching North Star. There can be other factors at play, but you have to, at the end of the day, at some point, they're going to call the question. Something will call the question, and you're going to have to decide what the priority is. And for us, I think it was very valuable. We articulated at the outset, this program is about economic national security. That was in our NOFO, that was in our strategy paper. That was when Grace from my team is here, when we sat in an investment committee and we talked about what investments we wanted to make. That was how we talked about it. When I was on the Hill talking to Republicans, that's how I talked about it. When I was on the Hill talking to Democrats, that's how I talked about it. And when we were trying to sell it to the American people, that's how we talked about it, right? And we weren't perfect, right? That we got but that consistent thread. And by the way, when I was talking to industry, when we were talking about the companies we were negotiating with, that's how we were talking about it. That's how we were justifying the fact that we were asking them to do more for less money. And so I think the consistency of that thread was a huge source of strength for us in implementing the program.
Well, thank you, everybody. I think now we will open it up to questions, because I'm sure many people have many questions about how we have more abundant industrial capacity.
Hi, thank you for the excellent talk. I'm a recruiter professionally, and it's really hard to build industrial capacity without people. How do you see immigration reform playing into building our industrial capacity right now? Like things like H-1B has become very difficult. There's just a huge amount of issues around immigration, and it's hard for me to imagine, there's people going to Stanford who are going to graduate who are from overseas, and in order to work here, they're going to have to get a visa, and right now we're making it very difficult. So how do you see immigration reform playing into the building more industrial capacity?
I think it's very important. I would say I worry about it more with respect to, where is the next $2 trillion company going to be built here or in another country, meaning that kind of innovation, startup ecosystem, that kind of top-end engineering talent, like that kind of thing. I do think it's important for manufacturing, Taiwanese workers, Korean workers, they have to be able to come. They have to be able to train American workers. We were able to kind of work through that with CHIPS. Like the existing immigration system was kind of worked well enough that it wasn't a huge supply constraint. But I think that we have to appreciate that particularly when we're talking about high-tech foreign companies, part of what we want is for their workers to come here and help train up our workforce so that our workers can do it going forward. And by the way, that's true the value of that is true not only for engineers, it's not only true for technicians, it also is true for construction workers. Because, hooking up a, $300 million piece of semiconductor manufacturing equipment to the electrical and piping of your fab, that's a craft, right? And if you've been doing it for 20 years in Taiwan, you're pretty good at it, so.
I'm an immigrant. I'm from Canada, so it's like sort of an immigrant, but it's like more of an immigrant now because of what's going
What are you talking about? It's the 51st state, man.
Yeah. So, I mean, I agree with everything Mike said. I think it's really important. I think it's like also something we should just have a lot more of in basically every area. So I'll keep it there.
I'm way out of my lane. I'll just say, obviously, you need a skilled workforce. You need STEM-like people. And I have no answer for it, but like if you're not going to basically kind of, be pretty open about at least sort of high-skilled, legal immigration to the U.S., then it seems to me you got to figure out how you get more domestic-born people coming to places like this who are gonna do STEMmy things and not become a history major like me and just be a talker. Which is great. It's been a great gig, but I'm glad that we've got lots of actual technical people from other places who come and build companies here and do those things. But if that's not what the future looks like, then like, you know, you got to figure out, you know, how, you know, people like me decide that like they're going to kind of do the much harder thing, frankly, and like take the math classes and the physics classes and the chemistry classes and the engineering classes.
Seems like you're just protecting your own job right now.
Absolutely.
I think we probably have time for one more question. Why don't we go over here?
In my understanding of your definition of industrial capacity as like industrial productivity, is part of the question on how to build more, how to reshore manufacturing jobs that are of higher skill or higher productivity. If so, what does that look like? And in the CHIPS Act specifically, was that part of the discussion? And how did you guys go about thinking about what jobs to bring back in manufacturing?
Yes, it's a great question. I think, and this is where we've talked a lot about allies and partners, and I think China roughly has, I think, third of global manufacturing capacity right now. I think by the end of the decade, they'll be at 40% on current trajectory. There's no world in which the United States is on its own building the industrial capacity to provide the type of supply chain security and resilience we want. So we have to work with allies and partners. What lens do you take in thinking about how you work with allies and partners? Well, one of them is kind of natural strength. So for example, in chips, on the leading edge, the most advanced chips, the buyers of those chips are all American companies. So like Apple and NVIDIA and AMD and Qualcomm, these are the major customers of TSMC. So it's, in that sense, maybe not an accident that when you look outside of Taiwan and Korea, where Samsung and TSMC operate, the United States is the major ecosystem that is developing in the world right now. There really isn't another one. You know, whereas if you look at where the fabs are being built out, you know, elsewhere in the world, you know, Japan, Germany, these are current generation mature chips that are serving the automotive sector, right? And that makes sense for their economies. And so, you know, there was a kind of natural sorting that happened that I thought was actually quite constructive. But another lens is just what's going to work commercially, right? Like when we sat in investment committee, we should focus on economic national security, commercial viability, financial strength, workforce, technical feasibility, and then a set of broader impacts. So that kind of commercial viability, the financial strength of the project was key. And as a result, when we announced our strategy or how we were going to define success, we were very clear, for example, that we wanted advanced, like high-tech packaging. So the chips, they go from the fab to the packaging facility. We wanted the high-tech packaging because that was important for a whole bunch of set of reasons. But for conventional packaging, we weren't going to, like, conventional packaging is still a bunch of people, you know, sitting and attaching wires to chips. And that is just, there's no world absent massive subsidies that's going to happen in the United States. And it's hugely important that if we produce chips here, or if chips are produced in Germany or Japan or wherever, that there are places outside of the PRC for those chips to be packaged, right? And so working with allies, you know, Secretary Mundo did a conference in Costa Rica to encourage packaging there. You know, obviously Mexico, Poland, like there are all these different places, but I think that that's a really important lens to take to it.
Yeah, I don't have much to add to that.
We maybe have time for one more. Then yeah, we'll do one more back there. Back there. Or no?
Just have sort of a follow-up question with regards to chips. So maybe for you, Mike, again. I would just be curious how you thought about, it seems like most of the conversation around industrial capacity has been more about supply chain resiliency and like actual like location of production as opposed to thinking about like national champions. I'd be curious if you could talk about that and like with respect to chips in particular, how important is it that like Intel be a success?
Another great question. I think it is important when we talk about national champions, you know, to be specific about the value of having American companies doing things on American shores. And I think there are real values, but it's helpful to articulate them. In the case of semiconductors, number one, having companies do R&D here is hugely valuable, right? And so if you're an American company, it's more likely that your major R&D hub is going to be in the United States. And in the case of Intel, they have a massive R&D facility in Oregon that is receiving funding through the CHIPS Act. That is a national treasure. What Intel does in Oregon, is yes, Intel is struggling to compete with TSMC. Their R&D in Oregon is a national treasure. There's also a lot of interest in the United States government for the ability to do classified work with companies in the semiconductor space. And so that's why there's a whole regime at DoD for engaging in that way. And either you have American companies or you have kind of international foreign companies with kind of governance set up around American subsidiaries to allow that. And so I think there's a lot of value to that too. That said, I think we definitely took the posture at CHIPS that yes, there's a lot of value, and there's a huge amount of value in onshoring production from foreign companies as well. And ultimately, what we wanted to do was build a kind of balanced, diversified portfolio. So when I talk about, okay, we have all 5 leading edge manufacturers investing on our shores. You have Intel and Micron, the American companies. You have TSMC, Samsung, and SK Hynix are companies from Taiwan and Korea. We have a major American company, Hemlock, that's working with Corning, another American company, to do a big polysilicon facility in Michigan. That polysilicon can then go to a wafer manufacturing facility in Texas, run by Global Wafers, a Taiwanese company, right? And so it's an integrated ecosystem that is really trying to pull in from all over the world.
With that, thank you to our panelists.